morning and greetings in Jesus' name. First of all, I'm not planning to have a Mother's Day message, but I thought maybe this evening I am moderating and I might, instead of having a devotional, I might open it up a little bit to share maybe something like just one thought that you, or appreciation you have for your mother, and maybe just open it up a little bit, because I think it is worthwhile to have a special time of commemorating our mothers on Mother's Day. But this was a message I had started a little while ago, and I continued on with it even though it was Mother's Day today. So I do want to recognize that. But this morning the message is going to be, the text is going to be found from 1 Corinthians 10:23 to 33, the last part of 1 Corinthians 10. And this is a continuation of the message I shared at communion on 1 Corinthians 10:14 to 22, which is in 1 Corinthians 10, he is talking here about idolatry, and that section was a prohibition on idol feasts, the Lord's Supper, and Satan's Supper, basically contrasting the two. And then today's section is, in my Bible, is entitled, Do All for the Glory of God. So we looked at, in that previous message, about the concept of fellowship between man and God as illustrated through the Lord's Supper. And then Paul contrasts it with worshiping idols and how that supper is dedicated to Satan. And so it is wrong to worship idols. He was making that point, and what we do with our worship matters. So he's kind of continuing this theme in this section of verses we want to look at today, and this time it's focusing on the eating of meat offered to idols and how that works out between believers, and how we do that when we're eating with unbelievers in this different scenarios here. And the problem, just to give a little context here, the problem facing the church in Corinth was that the church was divided over whether or not you could eat meat sacrificed to idols, and that was causing them to have division, so they weren't sharing their meals together, they weren't fellowshipping together, and therefore, because of this division, they weren't experiencing the fellowship they should have had as a church. And so Paul was writing back to the Corinthians, and among quite a few other issues, this was something he spent quite a bit of time addressing. He starts in chapter 18 and devotes 3 chapters here to this specific issue, and kind of comes at it from different angles and talks about how does the Corinthian church deal with meat offered to idols. And in one way, he's essentially trying to find a balance here between Christian liberty and Christian charity, or Christian love. How do the two of those two things, which kind of sometimes seem at odds with each other, how do we find this balance? Or what does our liberty in Jesus allow us to do or not to do? In other words, how do we use Christian liberty properly? And that's some of the things that come through as we are going to read these verses and study this a little bit this morning. Let's read it at this time, verses 23 to 33 in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. Whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you eat, asking no question for conscience sake. But if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. And why is my liberty judged of another's conscience? For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Give none offense neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. So the question here in this section of verses, and again, I feel a little bit like maybe I bit off more than I can chew here as far as this subject, because It has a lot of different angles, and the more I studied it, the more I realized how much there is to say about this subject, but I'll try to cover at least the things that stood out to me as I studied this. How are we going to glorify God in the use of our liberty? And, do we decide by human reasoning by saying, well, the Bible doesn't forbid this or forbid that, and therefore I can do it? And there's many different scenarios we could think of as we think of ways this works out. In this setting, it was meat offered to idols, but what about drinking alcohol or playing cards or buying things on a Sunday or reading the comics in the newspaper? There's all these different illustrations that people wrote about, some from older times and some that are current day. Whatever it is, it's kind of a gray area, morally or ethically, that you're not sure about. The Bible doesn't necessarily address it, or some of these things like alcohol, the Bible sometimes seems to say it's okay in certain cases. It also says it's not okay when it causes drunkenness, and it's very clear about that. So Christians arrive at different positions on some of these things. And how do we apply these principles so that we can do everything that you do can be done to the glory of God, and also done so that we don't offend other people while still having our own Christian liberty, or the right to, not the right, I don't like to use that word, it's not our rights, but we do have liberty in Christ that we're allowed to do some of these things, and it may be different than what other people do. Paul is pretty clear that there's different positions that we can arrive on some of these things. The issue here of unceremonially clean food is far removed from us. Most of us have a hard time bringing that into our culture because we don't abide by any dietary restrictions as part of our religion. Now, if you're Jewish or Muslim or something like that, that's a very real part of your life, but we don't follow that. And so it's a little bit hard to understand why this was such a big deal. Why did Paul devote 3 chapters in Corinthians here to this subject? Maybe just to give a little illustration there, I read an account from a missionary who served in India, and he said that in Indian culture, in India, this still is an issue in modern-day India, and I don't know when this was written, if it may have been a little while ago, but he said that each family in India has a patron god that they worship, and there's many different gods to choose from in Hinduism. And so it's the custom to go to a temple where your particular god is worshipped and bring a box of food, or like crackers or something like that. He uses the illustration, or some other kind of food. And then the priest at the temple will bless the food offering, or the box of crackers that you brought, and then hand it back to the person. And then the blessed food is called prasad. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that's what it looks like. And the worshiper takes the prasad, the blessed food, home and shares it with their family. And then if they're feeling sociable, they might go over to the neighbor and also share it with them too while they're having a conversation or something. So when this missionary, when the neighbor comes over with this box of crackers to share, he's faced with a question here. What does he do with that? Now, he said, should I, as a Christian missionary, eat this prasad that has been offered to an idol and chat with my Hindu neighbor, or should I refuse the food that my neighbor is offering? And again, if we look at these verses, there would be different scenarios where in some cases you would eat it, some cases you might not eat it. So what's a Christian to do in those cases? Another scenario, maybe kind of a simple scenario, but there was in a mission setting, somebody I knew that, I don't know how many of you had played Settlers of Catan. Is that a pretty common game, I think, board game? Quite a few of you play that. Well, one of the newer Christians there decided that he should quit playing that because there's a robber in it. And he said, so if I'm, as a Christian, playing as the robber, he doesn't think he should be doing that. And so he said he's not going to play that game anymore. Now, again, we might say, well, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, that's, nitpicking is such a little thing. But yet, if his conscience told him not to do it, what is my response as a Christian, or in that case, a missionary that was there in that case? Do I say, well, that's just a dumb idea. I mean, you need to get over it or something, or do I have conscience and respect his conscience in that way? So as we look at this theme of eating meat offered to idols, I want to look at 4 words here: permissible, patterns, profit, and purpose. And first of all, I'd like to think about permissible. What is permissible, or just think a little bit about what is Christian liberty. Verse 23 says, all things are lawful for me. And this was a popular cultural saying for the Corinthians. In the city of Corinth, it was a very pleasure-driven culture. People were fairly wealthy, and they spent a lot of time living to their flesh. And this was a popular saying in the Corinthian culture, that all things are lawful for me. I can do whatever I want to, basically. And or I have the right to do anything. And I think if you think about our culture today, the popular slogan, the Nike slogan, "Just do it," is another way that comes through. And much advertising promotes that idea too, that you can be whatever you want to be, you can do whatever you want to do. And so this is not necessarily a teaching of Paul here, that all things are lawful for me. He's saying, this is what you say in your culture: all things are lawful for me, I can do whatever I want to. You say that all things are permissible, but I say not all things come together for good. And so this is kind of the play of words that he's using there. You say all things are permissible, but I say don't allow yourself to be dominated by these permissions. And the New American Standard says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And if we're not careful, we can allow our freedom to become a slave master to us. And that's the balance here that we're looking at in this section of verses, that yes, there are many things that we can do as Christians, but Paul is saying some of them are not not worthwhile to do. So permissible, 1 Peter 2:16 says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. And that's just one of many verses in the New Testament where the teaching is given that we as Christians are free. That thought does come through very, very, very much in the New Testament. We are free in Christ, and we're no longer obligated to follow the law. And, of course, that's the ceremonial law of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. And we're also free from the bonds of sin. As we are freed through Christ, we're freed from those bonds of sin that previously held us. And Paul was not concerned with accidentally offending somebody while eating meat. Verse 25 there, he says, eat anything sold in the marketplace without raising questions of conscience. He says, whatever is sold in the shambles, which is King James terminology means the market, the meat market, where they sold this meat offered to idols. Whatever is sold there, that eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. So he's not really worried about accidentally offending somebody that you don't know. And he's not worried about what's done in private either. He says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal, go there and eat whatever they give you without asking questions. You don't have to dig into this and find out if this meat is if it's offered to idols or not. If they offer it to you, he says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Go ahead and take part in it and without asking questions. So there is a liberty here that the Christians had that the Jewish culture people would not have had, that Paul is saying here. Now you have freedom to do this. Romans 14:5-6. Maybe you can turn there if you want to, just if you're still there. It's just a few pages back in your Bible. Romans 14. He again addresses this to the Romans here, and there's quite a bit more said in this chapter about it, the weak and the strong. But verses 5 and 6 say, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it not unto the Lord, regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth thanks, and he that giveth, eateth not, so to the Lord he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. A lot of different thoughts in those two verses there, but basically he's saying some people esteem one day as Christians over another day. Some people think you should celebrate this day, and the other person says that you shouldn't. But he says, be fully convinced in your own mind. And Paul here is saying that we have freedom to come to different conclusions on the same subject. As Christians, there's freedom to arrive at different outcomes about something that we do, as long as our choice is honoring God and that we're convinced that we are honoring God by what we're doing. And that can be a little difficult for us to handle, I think, as conservative Mennonites. This thought that two Christians can arrive at different conclusions on something. We grew up in a culture where church standards are a very important thing, and they have guided us often in our Christian lives. And so this might sound a little unsettling here to say, well, one Christian might believe this and another Christian might believe that. What is that going to lead to? But again, this is what the Bible says, and so I think we have to take it and think about it and decide what it means for us as Christians, this Christian liberty and the other's conscience as well. Now, this Christian liberty is also not a pass to live to the flesh, and that's what the Corinthians earlier in here, they were using it basically as a pass for sexual immorality and saying we can do whatever we want to. And Paul was very clear about that too, that this Christian liberty is not just a pass that you can do whatever you want to in living to the flesh or into disobeying authority, as it seems like here the Corinthians were taking it. That's where they were running with it. And Paul is saying that you can exercise freedom until it becomes captivity, and that at some point our Christian liberty, if we're using it wrongly, can actually become something that becomes captivity instead of freedom. And Christian freedom always still requires self-control and moderation as well. Just because we're allowed to eat the meat offered to idols doesn't mean that we become gluttons of it, that allows us to do whatever we want to. Or if we say that if somebody says that they feel like they can drink alcohol and that it's not a problem for them, they still may not get drunk with it. The Bible is very clear that is wrong. And so just because we have Christian freedom, there's still self-control and moderation that applies in what we do and how we do it. There's lots and lots of choices we have today. It talks about here in the market, whatever is sold in the shambles or the markets. We have so many things to choose from in our day, whether it's the things that we listen to, the things that we watch. What may we partake of, and what about things like how do we observe Sundays, or what about voting, what about alcohol? All these things are different things that some Christians arrive at one conclusion and some arrive at another one. And so how do we decide when our liberty becomes captivity? And I think that's, first of all, it starts with ourselves. How do I apply these things to myself, and how do I decide what is allowable for me? And so that's point 2 here, is the pattern, and that I pulled that from Titus 2:7, where it says, "In all things, showing thyself a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing uncorruptness, gravity, and sincerity." And so Titus talks about showing this pattern that our lives as Christians should be showing a pattern of good works. And so my personal conduct should be something that over the arc of my Christian life is showing a theme of this pattern of good works. Paul uses 2 words here to judge whether we should do something, and he says it should be beneficial and constructive. Again, not maybe the exact words he uses in the King James, but this idea comes through that whatever we do when we're trying to decide if something is right, should we be doing it or not, is it beneficial and constructive, or we might use the word upbuilding. And that's the idea we see here in Titus 2, is that we decide what is good by whether it fits into a pattern of good works. Again, one test we can have is if my life is patterned after Jesus and after the Bible, does this thing that I want to add in, or I'm not sure what to do, does it fit into that pattern of good works, of good things? And these verses specifically talk about eating and drinking, and so our focus maybe could stay on that in thinking about this. What do we eat and what do we drink? But whatever we decide, we follow these principles. And I think there's three levels here. It's, first of all, my edification, that it needs to edify me in good works, this pattern of good works. Secondly, the other's conscience. And then thirdly, God's glory. And you could probably turn it around too and say first it should be God's glory, and then the other's conscience, and then my edification. But the way they're kind of written here in the chapter, they follow more of the first way that I have them there. So first of all, these verses only apply to issues not already specifically taught about in the Bible. If there's a clear biblical teaching about something, that always overrides and gives us direction on what we need to do. Then it's not a question. We have it already spelled out. We don't need to decide if this is right or wrong. It's not a question whether it's lawful or not. But as we know, there's a lot of situations that are not specifically addressed in the Bible. There's lots of modern things that, it doesn't say in the Bible what you should or shouldn't do. And so what is allowable for me to take part as a Christian? And Paul's answer to the Corinthians here is that all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful, and not all things build up. And so instead of arguing the point of every little thing, is this lawful or is that lawful or is that this or that or whatever, even if it's true that all things are lawful, the reality of the situation is that not all things build up. Just because we think that we can do something, there are some things that in the end we know are not going to build us up and not going to help us become stronger as Christians. So it might be okay in a technical sense. And I think alcohol is one of those things that you can look at the Bible and say, yes, it does talk about wine to make the heart glad, and Jesus used the wine at Cana, and the people got happier as they drank it, and some things like that, and use a little wine for your stomach's sake, and you can make a point that, yes, you probably can drink wine and drink alcohol without it being a sin, but is it, when you balance it against what it can lead to, is it still the worthwhile or the best thing to do? And then you see all the teachings against drunkenness, and you weigh those two things out, and you say maybe it is better just not to drink at all, never to do it, because even though I have the liberty, technically I have the liberty as a Christian, the outcomes, the potential for harm in starting to drink alcohol far outweighs the benefits of doing it, even if I am allowed to do it technically. Again, that's kind of the thinking. We have to start thinking beyond, but what's wrong with it? And that's often the first thing we as humans, when we're trying to decide something, we often ask that question, but what's wrong with it? So yes, we can eat the meat here offered to idols. We can go to the party or enjoy this activity or that music or whatever the scenario is. You can do that, but Paul is kind of changing the question here from not can I do this, but should I do this? And this is this thing that I'm trying to decide about, whether it's meat offered to idols or whatever it is it the best use of my time and energy and even of my worship? Because often these things that we start to partake of become something that eventually can take part of our attention from God and become almost a point of worship. Jesus said that where our heart is where our treasure is. And that's a very clear teaching. Jesus often talked about that. And so even though we as Christians have the right, technically we're allowed to invest in our vehicles and our vacations and our home renovations and our hobbies and all these things, we are allowed to do that. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. And they're all fine until all of a sudden you realize that you can't invest in God's kingdom because all your resources have been used up by these other things and there's nothing left. That's when it becomes a problem. And again, I had to think about sometimes it's very easy for myself to get wrapped up in all those things. None of them are wrong. Getting a nice vehicle, adding on to your house, going on vacations, all of those things can actually be good. They can be used for good purposes. But what about then when all of a sudden I realize I don't have time for anything else because all my time is consumed by these things? When I was up at Bradford, one of the people, the staff from the Reach Out Ministry said he said it's very, very hard anymore to get people to volunteer for terms of service. He said it's just gotten progressively harder to get younger people to come for terms of service. And I don't say that to blame the young people, because I think if the young people aren't going, it's because they're probably following the examples that's being left to them. If we're not willing to take and if our resources are all tapped because we're too busy doing other things and we're not able to help out, that's just something that's going to continue on into the next generation as well. And so again, I don't say that to scold, but there are these different things that in some ways are good and can be used rightly, but they can also quickly take over our life, and all of a sudden we don't have any resources left to build the kingdom of God because we're basically tapped out in these other things. So Paul says here that you can eat the meat, but understand there might come a time when you're not able to do that because there's a bigger issue at stake here. That there is a time when it's not just about your freedom, and that takes us to point 3 here, which is profit for others, seeking the other's good. In other words, how can I lay down what I want to do to profit others? And that's the other point that comes through in these verses here. Another verse, Galatians 5:13-14. I think I'll just read that one here. I think I have it. I forget which translation this is, but it says, "For you, brothers, were called for freedom, only don't use your freedom for gain to the flesh, but through love be servants to one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in this, that ye shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so, especially there in Galatians, it says, don't use your freedom to gain to the flesh, but through love be servants one to another. And that's a theme that I just pull one verse because we could look at so many different verses that have this theme in the New Testament here. So the third point here is the profit principle. Look to the good of others. Not profiting myself, but profiting the other. And does looking to the good of others actually change how you act in your everyday life? Like, is that something that it actually changes what I do because I'm trying to think about the other person, or is it often not even something we really exercise? Do we make decisions based on what we do will affect our neighbors, and why or why not? Again, there's this principle goes all through the New Testament. Philippians 2:3, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Again, the thing of putting your profit, the other person's profit, again, ahead of your own. And again, we may find it difficult to relate to scenarios that like eating meat offered to idols, but there's other ones like, modesty, again, drinking alcohol, what media you watch, music, dancing. David danced before the Lord, so does that make it okay? Maybe in some, I don't know, Jewish people, the men often dance as part of the Sabbath day service. But we take a stance against it. But again, that may be another thing where some people say, I as a Christian may do it, and we might say we don't do that. Now, some commentators or people writing about this, they've phrased the problem in this way. They say, can I go out in public and, using the example of alcohol, because I think that's a pretty good example of what a modern day example of this. Can I go out in public and have a drink, or must I be so afraid or paranoid of offending somebody that I don't even know is there, that I don't exercise my Christian liberty in this way? And that's something I've noticed, that theme kind of comes across from people, Christians writing about this. But I think that explanation of the problem is that, can I do anything? Because what if I accidentally offend somebody? It's what they call a straw man fallacy. A straw man argument is the idea that you distort somebody's argument by making it easier to attack or refute. So instead of addressing the actual argument, you say, well, they're actually saying something else, and then it makes it much easier to defeat it. And so it feels like when people are saying, well, if I can't go out and ever have a drink because somebody that I don't know might see me and be offended, that's not really what Paul is addressing here. He says if you don't know it, you can go out to the meat market and get the meat offered to idols, that eat asking no question for conscience sake. But he says there very clearly then too, or the question that he asks is not how far do I need to go to protect my brother and sister from falling, but how can I lay down my freedoms to protect them from falling? Not how far do I need to go, but how far can I go? Some other examples of this, so we want to avoid offending others' consciences wherever we can, and not do things that may be construed as endorsing sin. Another example I thought of in this area could be the speed limit. So if you feel it's okay to drive over the speed limit and you're not convicted by that, whatever it is, I'll be honest, I drive over the speed limit, usually 5 or 10 miles over. But if you're with somebody, especially you say it's a new Christian, and they believe that when the speed limit is set, it means if it's 55, you should be driving 55. What do I do in that case if I'm the driver? According to these verses, I should be driving 55 miles an hour and not 1 mile over, because I don't want to offend that brother or sister who has that conviction. It's not a time to try to tear down their conviction. Paul is saying here, in those cases when they have a different conviction, my job is to make sure I don't offend that conviction. Another example I thought of too was in COVID. A lot of people proclaimed their freedom to ignore COVID health restrictions and said, well, we're free to not need to wear masks and things like that. And that may have been okay for them. I'm not making a big argument about that. But what I didn't hear a lot of was voluntarily taking precautions for the sake of others, believers, who felt that we should obey the government mandate on that. Or in the public who was offended by people not wearing masks when they were asked to do that. Again, wouldn't have it been better to say, my conviction, I don't have a conviction about that, but if you do and when I'm around you, I'll wear it. Or when I'm in public, if I know I'm going to offend the public, I'll wear it there, and give up my rights rather than saying, I'm free in Christ and I can do whatever I want to. Again, there's all kinds of these scenarios where as we apply it to our life, we realize how much it can affect what we do and how we act. There's also the thing here of, we often like a black and white answer to things, a yes or a no. And Paul doesn't really give us a black and white answer here. He says, sometimes you do this, and sometimes you do that. It just depends what the situation is that you're in. Now, I think he gives a pretty clear direction as far as when you're in this situation, you do that, and when you're in this situation, you don't do that, or whatever, however he says it there. But he says it's right in some circumstances and wrong in other circumstances. And so it can sound a little bit like situational ethics, and we might feel a little uncomfortable with that. Well, just give us a clear answer, Paul, what you want us to do here. Is it right or is it wrong? And again, Paul is basically saying in some cases it's right, and in other cases it's wrong. And we as Christians need to find that balance. That brings us to the last point here, which is purpose. And I don't think, this is the perfect summary for this whole conversation here. That we do, everything that we do is done for God's glory. And that's how Paul sums it up here as he brings this chapter to a close here. The fourth and last point here is do all to the glory of God. And so the crux of his challenge here is found in verse 31, whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. And that's where Paul is finally maybe giving us a concrete statement here. This is what it comes down to. And we can ask, what is glory and how do we glorify God? And there's much, that could be a whole sermon series all of itself. But verses 31 and 33 are the reason why we do what we do. And it's why we deny ourselves, so that people in the church will be built up, and so that people outside of the church will be brought into the church. And that's the point Paul is making here. And so what are the goals? I think as we think about this and apply it to our lives, what are the goals that I've been chasing? What are my hopes and dreams and the purpose for my life? Is that purpose to do all to God's glory or to bring glory to myself? Is it the things that I want to do, or is it for God's glory? And I think that we'll only be able to live for the good of others when we're living only for the glory of God. When our goals and our rights are placed beneath the goals of God and the rights of others. And so, we place God's glory first, the rights of others second, and underneath is our rights and our liberty. When we do everything to God's glory, we will be transformed. And I had to think about how Moses, when he came down from Mount Sinai, he shone with a light that people couldn't look at him. Or Jesus at the Transfiguration, where it was a visible shining forth of his glory because it was coming through. They had seen God. And I think as we do everything that we do to the glory of God, we will be transfigured in the sense, too, that people will look at our lives and it'll be like a light shining out. And the world can see that, and it will draw them towards the church and towards us as Christians. And so that, again, is the summary of all these verses. How we decide what we do is do all to the glory of God. That's the one principle that Paul is very clear on here, and that is never a negotiable. Whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. And I think I'll just read these verses yet in summary here, or as we close from the Holman Bible. Therefore, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do everything for God's glory. Give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also try to please all people in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. And that's I hope our purpose as we think about these verses and what we do in our everyday life, that we do everything for God's glory. So at this time, why don't we kneel for a word of prayer?